Have you heard about Hitchbot? Did you hear the story of Hitchbot? A few of you heard the story of Hitchbot. Hitchbot was a Canadian experiment. It was done by a group of engineers in Ontario. They wanted to make a robot, and they did. They made a robot who was going to hitchhike across the country. And they built this robot out in Ontario, and it made its way actually all the way from Halifax to Victoria in under a month. 19 rides. 19 people picked up this robot who, it kind of had its screen displaying and a little tag saying Victoria or bust, and it was going to make it across. And we communicate just in very rudimentary ways with people as it went across. That was in 2014. 2015, it continued its journey of connection through Germany. Late 2015, they made another one in an attempt to go across the United States from Salem, Massachusetts to San Francisco, California. That time, however, poor Hitchbot was beheaded in Philadelphia, dismantled wire from wire. Headlines about the beauty of robots and the horror of humanity were abundant. And yet, this experiment in what's possible for human connection with technology and what's possible with human goodwill, a robot made it across the country of Canada in less than a month. A robot was attacked and dismantled in less than 2 weeks in its United States journey. And that's why we come to church. Here. That's why we come here to church. No, it's to continue in this experiment of connection, to be the people who will get the robot all the way across and not dismantle it. Welcome. So glad to be with you. Will you rise in body or spirit and we'll sing together? I want to try something a little different for our time of centering, this time of arriving. So before you plant your feet on the floor and take a deep breath, I want you to pull out your phone if you've got one on you. If you've got a phone and you use text messages, pull it on out. And if you don't use text messages, or you don't have a phone, you can do this the old-fashioned way. Some people call it prayer. But there's a lot of different words for it. You just follow along and do it kind of in your mind. But everybody who has a phone, I would invite you to try this. Try pulling your phone out. So just feel yourself connected down to this good earth. Feel your feet on the ground. And your breath moving in and out. And feel that silicone, that plastic case, that metal accompaniment that you have with you day in and day out, that spot, that beam of connection, connecting you to a great web. And call to mind, if you will, someone who you care about, someone who maybe you've been meaning to reach out to for a while, someone who's been on your mind. A family member or a friend. Someone who could use a little extra love right now. And if you've got your phone with you, just send them a little note. Go ahead and let them know you're sitting in church thinking about them. Whatever would be a meaningful message from you. Or simply imagine them, simply hold them in your awareness. Picture them imagine reaching out with the glowing light of your love surrounding them. The buzzes and dings of connection. The miracle of closeness, even when far away. As we enter into the time of silence, of stillness together, imagine those digital connections leaping through the sky, through cords underneath the earth, across oceans. Connections leaping all around our globe. The first text message sent using SMS protocol was sent on December 3rd, 1992, just over 25 years ago now. But it took almost a decade, of course, for it to become easy to use for mass markets. It wasn't until 2010, actually, that the verb texting was added to the dictionary, just 8 years ago. And last year, in 2017, around the world, 22 billion text messages were sent every day around the world. That's 8 trillion messages. 8 trillion text messages over the course of 2017. And that doesn't even account for applications like Facebook or WhatsApp that combined are used to send maybe another 60 billion messages a day, so another 3 times as many. Does anyone else get exhausted just imagining that? All that data, all that information. Months, or maybe it was years ago, I was complaining one day, a shock, I am sure, for all of you, about the number of emails in my inbox to a friend. Are any of you familiar with a conversation like that? Have you ever complained about email? My friend is a friend from seminary, and he's a Christian, and so he had a scriptural response, scriptural wisdom ready for just such a moment. He said, Ecclesiastes 12:12, but replace books with email. So I looked it up. I, like many of you likely, cannot immediately recall Ecclesiastes 12:12. May never have read it. Here's what I found when I looked it up. Of making many emails there is no end, and much study wearies the body. Of making many emails there is no end, and much study wearies the body. Those who worked before the age of email, I had an email account, my first one, I think when I was about 10 years old. So I've never known the world without email, really. Those who worked before the age of email, though, they assure me that it truly has made a number of things much easier. Work that once took tedious time and energy has become much simpler with the ubiquitous presence of digital communications. The creative collaborations that are made possible by instantly sharing documents, photos, all other sorts of media are truly astonishing. But there's a cost, right? There's a cost to this power of instant and unlimited digital communication. Because while our technical capacity for sending and receiving messages is now limited only by the speed of our typing, and not even that, if your voice, whatever it's called, dictating, while the technical capacity is unlimited, it's not clear that our physiological capacity, our biological capacity for managing so much information has kept pace or really changed much at all. And yet we feel now responsible for every message coming in, for way more productivity than is really good for us. For decades now, psychologists and others have been warning about information overload, the stress, anxiety, overwhelm, resulting difficulty in decision-making created by the context in which we are trying to sort through more information than our systems can reasonably process. Information overload. And I was amazed to discover, as I was looking back at the history of this idea of information overload, that those who study it trace back through 18th century philosophers who worried about a dramatic increase in book publishing. There's apparently about 150% increase in book publishing in the 18th century. They were getting worried. To the 15th century, of course, invention of the Gutenberg printing press, back to the Roman philosopher Seneca the Elder, who said, "The abundance of books is a distraction." And finally, to the earliest recording of fretting over information overload, yes, Ecclesiastes 12:12. It was months after my friend had told me that I found that in the research. And as I drifted back to this history, I couldn't help but think, books? They were worried about books? One coherent narrative that doesn't ripple with the hour with replies and comments and likes and reactions and retweets. Books, they feel like a tranquil, still refuge from information overload, from the information overload of the internet-connected lifestyle. And last week I was talking a bit about the theology of connection, about one attempt at naming our shared worldview as Unitarians. The short version is the beliefs and practices that lead to connection with ourselves, with our deepest selves, with others, with life. Those beliefs and practices are in, while beliefs and practices that lead to disconnection are out. Right? That's this theology of connection. And so as I struggle with finding a balanced use of technology in my life, and I've heard from so many others, from many of you, that it's a shared struggle, I've been wondering how to apply this rubric of connection to the problem. So here's some noticings. I notice connection between our son, 2-year-old Henry, and his grandparents sustained through FaceTime, through video calls, intimate relationship from such a young age made possible across great distances for the first time. I noticed disconnection over phones at school by grade 6, 7, 8, or even younger. I hear stories of kids shaming one another over whether they have smartphones or dumb phones or no phones at all. Connection in private Facebook groups. Private Facebook groups for those maybe with an uncommon illness or other rare circumstances who would never otherwise meet, get to interact with others who share and understand their story. Disconnection as social media feeds highlight only the brightest moments of our lives, leaving us to despair when we go through hard times that others seem to only experience shiny joy. Connection, I notice as another friend of mine, Unitarian minister Jeremy Nickel, develops sacred VR, sacred virtual reality, and hosts people meeting up in a meditation space in virtual reality from around the world. People from Iceland, Romania, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, the United States, and Canada, he says, sharing a powerfully connected meditation despite not being present physically with each other. And disconnection, as the statistics of reactivity drive political discourse toward the most incendiary and offensive speech, a megaphone for the rhetoric of hate and oppression. Microsoft created a Twitter robot, and another experimental robot who would actually learn from the conversations it engaged in on Twitter Tay it was called, they had to stop at less than 24 hours because it had learned so quickly to spew a steady stream of misogyny and racism. What connection and disconnection do you notice? When you use your devices and your screens, when you see other people using their devices and their screens, people of your generation, people of another generation, what connection and what disconnection do you notice? Would you take a moment to just share some of that with somebody near you? What I would like you to do is just go back and forth for a minute or two, just offering, I notice connection, I notice disconnection, facilitated by technology. So give it a try if you will. You can continue those conversations after the service. Sorry to interrupt. Or you can join me for sin and salvation. Or is there any difference? All right, so I think we have a challenge in front of us. I really think we've got a challenge in front of us. We have a challenge as a culture that's out of balance with its use of technology, and that means that we have a challenge here as a community within the culture, and again as individuals, in how we balance the use of technology in our own lives, right? And one of the hallmarks of liberal religion is that we generally embrace modernity. While many religious traditions resist the changing times, we tend to lean into them. But I was struck recently by something that Kevin Kelly, who's a technologist and philosopher of technology, said about the practice of Amish communities in regards to new technology. Kevin Kelly, he's the founding editor of Whole Earth Catalog and also Wired Magazine. Wired Magazine, the prominent magazine about digital technology, right? So he was talking about the Amish. It was a surprise, and I was delighted by it. It was during an interview with Krista Tippett on the program On Being. He said, the Amish, and he explained, for listeners who don't know, a group of religiously bent people, heritage out of Northern Europe, who are seen as being anti-technological, but he said are really just behind. They're just later than us. And the canonical vision, he said, of the Amish are a community who don't have electricity, who do things without much technology, but in fact the story is a little more complicated than that. They're changing all the time. They're in the process of always evaluating the technologies. And it's that process, he says, he finds most interesting. I was really very, very curious about how the Amish decided what they were going to use and what they weren't. And they're not that different than most of us, because most of us are at the point where we can't use all technologies. Most of us are at the point where we can't use all technologies. There's just too many. So we make decisions. And from the outside, our decisions look kind of crazy, irrational. Okay, Kevin says, I have state-of-the-art internet, but we don't have a TV. That doesn't make any sense. No, it doesn't make any sense. And the Amish they'll have no cars and no bicycles, but they'll have skateboards. They don't have zippers, but they'll have disposable diapers. And you kind of look and you say, what's the strategy? What's the theory here? He says, well, the theory is very simply that unlike most Americans, he says Americans, but it could easily be Unitarians, we're individualistic. So we decide individually about what we're going to do or not do. We're going to use email, but we're not going to use Facebook. But the Amish are different in this way. They decide collectively. And here's what the criteria the Amish use implicitly to decide whether they're going to adopt a technology. The criteria are basically two things. One is, will this technology strengthen my family, increase my family? The Amish, their ideal is to have every meal with their children until they leave home. They want to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day with their children. And then the second one is very similar. Does it strengthen the community? How much time does it bring them and keep them in the community? So the reason why they have horses instead of cars is because the horse can only go about 15 miles away. And so they have to go shopping and go to church and go to visit all within 15 miles. And that forces them to pay attention, to support their local neighborhood, their own community. And so when they're looking at new technology, like, say, LEDs or whatever, does it help them do that or not? So they're not rejecting technology, he says. They're saying we want technology that serves our purposes. Technology that serves our purposes. And the way they do this is also interesting. They have Amish early adopters. And these are guys, usually, in the community who are eager to try new things. And they have to get permission from the bishop. And so the bishop will say, okay, Ivan, yeah, you can have a cell phone in your truck for work. And so for the next year, they watch. His community watches Ivan to see how that affects his family, his community, his work. And if they don't think that it's a positive, at the end of that year, he has to give it up. So it's a community decision. And I feel both a compelling fascination with this process, like I think it would probably be good for me, but also an absolute horror at the idea of turning over a decision like whether or not I can use a new technology to other people. And this is a key dilemma of liberal religion, because I'm not really sure. I might be happier if I and everyone I knew stayed within about 15 miles and put community and family first. Unless, of course, some important identity like my sexuality was not accepted by the tight-knit community. And there's some anthropological research to back up the Amish theory of happiness. You might have heard about the Dunbar number. It's theorized in the 90s by Robin Dunbar, who was an anthropologist. And it was a guess at the number of meaningful social relationships that humans can comfortably maintain. And based on the correlation between primate brain sizes and the sizes of their social groups. And so often the number is thought to be about 150. Scholars in the field say maybe 100 to 250, somewhere in there. It's research that's often quoted in church literature, examining congregational size dynamics. But so I don't use Facebook all that much myself, but I've been on it since 2004 when I was at Vassar College, and it's still the days where you had to have one of the email addresses from those elite schools to get onto Facebook. And so I have, over that 14 years, accumulated over 1,500 friends without using it too much. 1,500 friends, and yet I can maintain meaningful relationships with about 150 people. And yet, I can be instantaneously in touch with 1,500 people at any moment. People who feel connected to me, who I've felt connection to. Besides the sheer overwhelm, one of the other consequences that researchers are noticing about social media, they've posited that because people are staying connected with friends in the midst of a highly mobile, geographically mobile culture, it may make us harder to connect with in our local neighborhoods and families, our local communities. So that is, if those 150 slots are already in use with friends from the last place we lived, or from university, or from high school, making new connections may be difficult. Relationships can become another form of information we are overloaded with. Like I told our kids, I don't have the answer to the end of the story. But one thing I try and do about this overload in my own life is X-formation. X-formation comes from interplay, this playful, embodied approach to spirituality that's a foundation of my practice. It's almost self-explanatory, X-formation. If too much information is coming in, then we need to do some X-formation to get it out. Exformation can take all shapes and sizes. It can generally involves loud sounds, big thrusty gestures, shouting in the car, yelling back at the news, crumpling or ripping paper up, hitting pillows is a classic, of course, making art, speaking gibberish, making faces, a good tongue-out raspberry. Anything to get that information out. One of the simplest ways that I try to practice multiple times every day is just to take a deep breath and let it out with a sigh. Would you do that with me for just a moment? Because the long-term consequences of information overload are health-threatening, even life-threatening stress. If your focuser has been working extra hard, you might want an extra silly release of exformation. So if you want, you can just take your fingers like this, clutch them right to your forehead. Yeah, anybody who's brave enough can do it with me now. You just kind of clutch them like you're grabbing that focuser, and then you take your fingers, fling them out, and say, "Whee!" Good thing to do after any sermon. Whee! So this I pray, this I hope, that our discernment, rooted in our intuitive understanding of what connects us and what disconnects us, be honed and sharpened. That we reach for our tools with purpose to serve our deep and real needs. That we remember to set them aside also, to resist the forces working to keep us glued to our screens. That balance in the wisdom of our knowing, our own individual knowing, and the wisdom in our families and our communities serves to guide us towards using technology to reach for the quality of life we long for. And that our voices, our votes, our vision help to shape a technological future that truly reduces human suffering, that liberates time and creativity, that embraces the goal of equity and the reality of interdependence. This I pray, this I hope. May it be so. Amen.